The next part of this chapter deals with the humanistic perspective. And this perspective was mainly a strong reaction to Freud and his view on personality. So where Freud had focused on the unconscious and our desires and urges, the humanistic approach focused on the role of our conscious, our creative potential, and self-actualization. So if you remember from 104, self-actualization is one of those keywords that makes you realize we're talking about the humanistic perspective. Maslow and Rogers are psychologists who are well known for being part of this humanistic perspective, and they focused importantly on the innate tendency of human beings to move towards self-actualization. Now, self-actualization is rather a vague idea. It's called the total realization of one's human potential. You could think of it as being the best person that you can possibly be. People who follow this idea of self-actualization would believe that an individual's creative potential, their potential to do things in the world, is inborn and something that they're constantly striving to do. So it's a motivating force in their lives. And Maslow, who is our driving force behind Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he considered self-actualization to be the ultimate human need. It is what we are all striving for, and it is what we all aim for in our lives. So it would be the highest expression of human nature to achieve self-actualization. Now, just like Freud was the driving name behind the psychodynamic perspective, we're going to look at George Kelly and Carl Rogers as the two driving forces behind our humanistic approach as it comes to address personality. So even though we think of Maslow in particular when we think of this humanistic perspective, when we're looking at personality and the ideas of the self, Kelly and Rogers are going to be the ones we're focusing in on. We're going to talk about Kelly first, even though both Kelly and Rogers proposed their theories around the same time. But Kelly started with their personal construct theory. And this is a theory that had a very strong influence on how we view theory of personality and even affected clinical psychology as a whole. So it's a pretty influential theory. And their primary interest was how people were constructing their reality. So Kelly basically said that people are striving to make sense of the world in which they live, and they make sense of this world by putting together these personal constructs, these cognitive categories that sort the people and their events in their lives into sort of these manageable concepts. So the idea is that to make sense of their world and the environment around them, people would try and make these constructs, these categories to put stuff into, and then they would approach it kind of like a scientist approaches a question, where they would have their construct and they would make a prediction based on the construct that they've formed, and they would see if the outcomes that they observe match their put together constructs. And the way that they put together these personal constructs would be the primary basis for individual differences in personality. So this kind of brings us back to chapter 9, where we started talking about perception and thought involving categorization of things around us. So our personality would be influenced by how we are forming all of these different concepts, how we are breaking things down into categories and then viewing the world based on the categories that we've made. So if each individual has their own way of making constructs, they're going to view the world through a slightly different lens than anyone else. So any one student in the class may have their own construct of what it means to be a good student or to be successful in life. And those constructs will differ between individuals based on how they were raised and what they view as being successful. And Kelly had argued that if we can understand some of these categories, these constructs that people are putting together to understand their reality, we can start understanding that person's psychological world. We can understand how they're interpreting the world around them. And that gives us insight into their internal world. So how they're choosing to act and behave based on the information that they're taking in from their environment. To give an example, think of you and one of your friends watching a TV show together. And the main characters in the show are a couple and they break up. You and your friend might have different categories or different constructs to evaluate that breakup. You might think of the breakup as being a simple incompatibility issue. Maybe they just didn't work together and this was a good outcome. But if one of you has had a bad breakup in the past, maybe there's a tendency to view these relationships as one-sided. Maybe someone was jilted by the other. So maybe you're going to view the breakup as something where one person was at fault for it and the other person wasn't. And so depending on your previous experience, you can interpret that situation differently and you can behave differently because of your interpretation of the event. So if you view it as a mutual breakup, then maybe you're not upset by it. But if you see it as one person was at fault, then maybe you get angry about it. And that can start influencing your behavior towards it. Maybe you're in a bad mood now or something like that. So the way that you frame things, the constructs that you put together, can start changing your behavior. And Kelly took an interesting view on these personal constructs because he wasn't necessarily looking to show that any one construct was right or wrong. He wanted to help his clients identify which constructs were maladaptive in their lives, which ones weren't leading them to have productive behavior. And maybe he could try and lead them to developing more adaptive or useful constructs that would help them do better in life. So if a person has a constantly negative construct of the world is out to get me and things are never going to work out for me, Kelly might try and put them in a situation where they would feel more positive. Maybe they'd have to face the idea that, maybe things are working out. Maybe your construct is wrong and things could be more positive. So Kelly used a technique called fixed role therapy, where he would basically get people to pretend that they're more positive, and to try and introduce them to different patterns of thinking and different ways of viewing the world, in the hopes that it might stick. This brings us to the bulk of the chapter, or the bulk of this section of the chapter, where we can talk about Carl Rogers and his theory of self, or his self theory. This self theory focused on what Rogers at the beginning called the self, but what has evolved to now be called self-concept. And this is a centralized idea, an organized and consistent set of perceptions and beliefs that we each form about ourselves. Once we've established this concept of who we are, of our self-concept, we have a tendency to maintain it. And this idea, this concept, has a tendency to play a powerful role in guiding our perceptions and even directing our behavior. According to this theory, we should strive for self-consistency, which is consistency among our self-perceptions. So you might think, I am a kind person and I am a nice person, and those are consistent with each other, so there isn't a problem. We also strive for congruence, which is consistency between our self-perceptions and our experience. So if you think you are a nice person and your actions also tell you that you're a nice person, then you have congruence. But we can have issues when your experiences don't match your self-perceptions. So maybe coming into university, you're used to you're used to thinking of yourself as a smart person, but maybe you get a bad grade on one of your tests. All of a sudden now there's conflict between your self-perception of yourself as a smart person and your experience where you got a bad grade. So now what do you do? So our experiences are not matching our concept, and we start feeling a sense of threat. So if you are a healthy, well-adapted individual, you might start to modify your self-concept. Okay, maybe I'm a good student or I'm a smart person. I'm just not that great at X topic. Maybe you are like me and maybe I'm not that great at physics. So you modify your self-concept to accommodate those new experiences. Some people might go a different route and they might start distorting reality. So instead of realizing that, okay, well, maybe my self-concept isn't completely accurate, they would start distorting the reality. So maybe the instructor just asked cheaty questions. Maybe it wasn't a fair test. I'm a really smart person, but the test was wrong. So that distortion of reality where it's not my fault, it's something else going on. We can evaluate our level of adjustment. How well adjusted are you? By evaluating the degree of congruence or matching between your self-concept and your experience. So if we take a look at this next slide here, individual B has a strong overlap of their concept of self or their self-concept and their experience. So lots of purple means there's lots of overlap, so they are a fully functioning individual where they've integrated their experiences with their idea of the self. There's very little distortion. But if you have very little overlap, if there's a lot of divergence between the concept of the self and their experience, then you run into things like distortion, where, it's not my fault, it was the test, or denied experience, where you start denying that the reality of what happened actually happened. And this is called maladjustment. So you can deny or distort reality to be consistent with your self-concept. So you ignore stuff that doesn't match with your view of yourself. Next, we can talk about self-esteem, which is how positively or negatively we feel about ourselves. So where we had talked about our self-concept being sort of how we define ourselves, our self-esteem would be how we evaluate all those things that we define ourselves as. How do we feel about who we are as a person? For the most part, high self-esteem is viewed more positively. It has more positive outcomes. You end up with fewer interpersonal problems. You are more capable of forming loving relationships, and you tend to achieve at a much higher level than those with poor self-esteem. And poor self-esteem comes along with things like anxiety, depression, poor social relationships, and underachievement. So it seems like you would be better off having high self-esteem, but there is the potential for taking it too far. If you have unrealistically high self-esteem, if you think too highly of yourself, you can run into problems. And you can also have issues with unstable self-esteem, where sometimes you think highly of yourself and sometimes less so. Those situations can actually be even worse than having low self-esteem. So you might start reacting aggressively, especially if you have unrealistically high self-esteem, if someone points out that maybe you aren't as worthy of that high self-esteem as you think you are. So in some cases, you're a lot better off with a realistic level of self-esteem, but better off if it's towards the high end, as long as it's realistic. Continuing on with things that can be problematic, the pursuit of self-esteem itself can be problematic. If you're doing things to try and obtain self-esteem, if you're trying to get good at a particular task because you want to feel good about yourself, if you want to have that increased self-esteem that comes from accomplishing that task, you can actually run into issues where it causes more problems than it's worth. So if your goal is improved self-esteem, you're going to feel less of an accomplishment if you accomplish that task than if you were just doing the task to try and master that task. If the goal is enhanced self-esteem, the victory kind of ends up hollow, where you don't feel as good about yourself as you would otherwise. And if you don't obtain that goal, if you don't do the task that you sought out to do, you find more detrimental effects if your goal was enhanced self-esteem. So again, it's not the best idea to go out of your way to try and artificially boost your self-esteem by attempting other tasks to boost that feeling. But if trying to seek out self-esteem is detrimental in a lot of cases, how do we go about fostering self-esteem? How do we get to a good level of self-esteem? And a lot of it actually comes from how we're raised. If we experience unconditional acceptance and love from our parents when we're growing up, or from other authority figures, it doesn't have to be parents, it could be a teacher, a coach, some other adult figure in your life who gives you that feeling of acceptance and love, it can help foster improved self-esteem. Having clear guidelines for behavior can also help foster self-esteem. If we're raised with this feeling of positive reinforcement for following the guidelines that tell us how to behave, and we can have this feeling of freedom to make our own decisions and express our own opinions within those guidelines, we feel free to start developing our own feeling of self-esteem. So having that positive environment leads to better self-esteem later in life. And it's obtained in a healthy way as opposed to an artificially obtained way through undertaking different tasks and seeking goals. Rogers also believed that all humans were born with this innate need for a positive regard. Basically, that we all have this inborn need for acceptance, sympathy, and love from others. He viewed this positive regard as an essential aspect required for our healthy development. And so in an ideal case, we would receive unconditional positive regard. So children would get the idea that they are inherently worthy of love no matter what. So they got this positive regard independent of their behavior. But sometimes children are raised with more of a feeling of conditional positive regard, where this positive regard, that feeling of acceptance and love, is dependent upon their behavior. So they only get positive regard if they behave a particular way. And this arrangement creates what are called conditions of worth. These are internalized standards of our self-worth, where we decide that we are worth more when we behave in a certain way and see a certain kind of positive regard from others. Now, this positive regard doesn't just apply to how others perceive us. We should also have a positive self-regard. Now, this is a case where we can feel good about ourselves. We can feel good about who we are as a person. But if we have a lack of unconditional positive regard, if we ended up with conditional positive regard from others, we can run into some issues. And again, those conditions of worth that we developed can kind of cause some issues with our own self-regard. So we might not have unconditional positive self-regard. We might start applying those conditions where we only value ourselves when we meet certain standards or when we behave in a certain way. And those conditions that we then set on ourselves can start influencing our behavior. If we were punished as a child for acting out angrily, maybe we deny ourselves any form of acting on anger, even if it would be healthy in a particular situation. So maybe we stop standing up for ourselves because we might be perceived as angry, and then we would be worth less to others. So in order to be a fully functioning person, we should be regarding ourselves positively. We should be comfortable with who we are. We should have a feeling of self-determination, a sense of inner freedom. We accept our experiences as they are, and we don't distort our reality. Now, just like we talked about how this perspective has continued onward, how research has moved forward from these original people establishing ideas in this field, we can talk about how the humanistic approach is currently being researched. And most of what we see in terms of humanistic approaches to personality are going to center around things like self-verification and self-enhancement motives. So Rogers had talked about the idea of people being motivated to preserve their self-concept by way of maintaining self-consistency and congruence. Modern researchers use a lot of the same concepts and ideas, but they would call this need a need of self-verification. And this is a pretty big area of research right now. And there's lots of support for this idea. In one particular study, or one particular type of study, they found that students who are given feedback for how they interact with others, if they have descriptions that are consistent with their view of who they think they are and how they think they are, they're going to recall things that are more consistent with their self-descriptions, and they tend to ignore things that are inconsistent with their self-descriptions. So if somebody thinks of themselves as outgoing and kind, but a researcher plants false feedback saying that they were shy and withdrawn, the participant might actually ignore that feedback and say that, yeah, no, I was definitely very outgoing and kind. So we tend to seek out relationships that help confirm our view of ourselves. So not only do we like to hear feedback that is consistent with our view of ourselves, we like to interact with people who view us in a similar way. So if people think of us the way that we think of ourselves, those relationships tend to last longer. You're going to be with a spouse who views you the way that you view yourself longer than if you have conflicting views of who you are as a person. And this works for friends as well. Modern research also focuses in on the idea of self-enhancement. So Rogers had talked about our need to regard ourselves positively, which lines up with the modern idea of self-enhancement, where we have a tendency to gain and preserve positive self-image. So over time, our sense of self, our view of ourself, tends to become more positive. So when we're teenagers, we don't tend to have a very strong sense of self-esteem. We don't feel positively about ourselves. But as we move into our adult years, that self-esteem, that positive view of ourself gets stronger, and it holds at a pretty positive rate throughout adulthood, though it does tend to decline with age. But this idea of self-esteem and having this positive view of the self contributes to our psychological well-being. If we feel good about ourselves, we tend to feel good overall. And it wouldn't be a complete view of this way of thinking if we didn't evaluate the idea of culture, gender, and the self. So how do cultures and cultural upbringings affect our self-perception? How does gender affect perception? And so we've talked a lot about individualistic versus collectivistic cultures in this course. And we see the same pattern that we would expect to see, where individualistic cultures tend to have a more independent and personal focus on their idea of the self. So this graph here is referring to a study where you ask participants to list 20 things about themselves that start with the statement, I am. And so you could say, I am tall, or I am a student, or I am kind. And you can evaluate those statements about what you are as an individual and decide if it counts as something that is a personal trait, like I am kind, or a social relational trait, like I am an oldest child, or I am a father. And we find that the red bars, so for an American population, an individualistic culture, we see a lot more statements that are personal in nature as opposed to social or relational. And we see the opposite for a Japanese population, which would be the collectivistic culture, where they would focus more on their social relationships with others. So an individualistic culture focuses on the individual and their personal achievement, as you might expect. And a collectivistic culture tends to focus on achievement of group goals. So less about the individual and more about the group, which again makes sense. And in terms of gender, when we start looking at sex differences, and as per usual, most of the research has stuck with a dichotomy of sex, where it's males or females, but more research is being done to look at a broader spectrum. But our gender schemas, the idea of what a typical man or a typical woman should be doing, can start coloring our view of the self. So a lot of males, regardless of culture, and this is sort of male overall, tend to value things like achievement, strength, and self-sufficiency. They tend to be more individualistic traits, whereas females tend to value things like helpfulness, kindness, and self-competencies, things that are a little bit more akin to collectivistic views. And so overall, we can see that males tend to be more individualistic than females, but that's as a group. There are individuals. There can be individual females who are more individualistic. There can be males who are more collectivistic. But as a whole, males tend towards the individualistic end of the spectrum, and females tend towards the collectivistic end of the spectrum. So we can see effect of culture, we can see sex differences, and this can shape our perception of the self. And now to wrap up, we can talk about critically evaluating these humanistic theories. So what do people have to say critically about these types of theories? And you can kind of figure out some of these. A lot of people have an issue with reliance on self-report. How do you evaluate a person's view of their self? Well, you tend to ask them about it. And when we talked about different ways of doing science, self-reports are open to a lot of problems. So people might not be telling the truth. People might not know the truth to tell it to you. And we might end up with sort of biased results because of what they decide to tell you or not tell you. There's also some issues with scientificness of these types of ideas. So how would you have an operational definition of self-actualization tendency? How do you go about measuring someone's ability to self-actualize? How do you know if someone has achieved self-actualization? They're very abstract concepts, and they're pretty hard to pinpoint and define in order to study. There are some positives, though, because these humanistic theories have had a positive contribution to psychotherapy approaches, where at the beginning of a sit down with a therapist, so if you decide you're going to go see a therapist for a couple of months or a couple of years, at the beginning, the psychotherapist can establish what is your view of an ideal person? Who do you want to be? And where do you see yourself presently? So how much discrepancy is there between your perceived self, between who you are right now, and your ideal self, the person that you want to be? And they can sort of tailor your therapy sessions to try and lessen that gap, to get rid of that discrepancy and get your perceived self closer to the ideal self. And you can reevaluate towards the end of therapy to see if you've lessened that gap and see if your perceived self is closer to your ideal self. So there are ways to make it work. There are, of course, just people who have issues with certain aspects of this view.